Buenas tardes, gracias por estar aquí con nosotros en la tarde de hoy. A nombre del personal no docente, docente y estudiantil del Instituto de Estudios del Caribe, les doy la bienvenida al ciclo 35 de las conferencias caribeñas. Las conferencias caribeñas tienen una historia de más de 15 años de manera ininterrumpida y son una manera que el instituto cumple con su misión de divulgar conocimiento, fomentar el diálogo regional y contribuir a la internacionalización de la UPR. Las conferencias están disponibles en el repositorio institucional de la UPR y en el Internet Archive, además de nuestro canal de YouTube. Pueden seguirnos en nuestras cuentas de Facebook y X para estar al tanto de las próximas actividades, otras conferencias y otras actividades co-curriculares. So I'd like to welcome everyone here today on behalf of the researchers, the non-teaching staff, and students who work in the Institute of Caribbean Studies. We welcome you to the 35th cycle of the Conferencias Caribeñas. Let's see. Okay, sorry about that, and thanks for speaking up, whoever that was. We've gone through part of the welcome in Spanish, and now we're continuing in English. The Institute of Caribbean Studies thanks all of you for attending and welcomes you to this hybrid event. This event is part of a larger project that the Institute has launched. It began about 15 years ago, and it's one of the ways in which the Institute of Caribbean Studies complies with its mission, which includes creating knowledge, cultivating regional dialogue in the Caribbean, and contributing to the internationalization of our campus. These conferences are recorded and they're put online in our institutional repository, as well as the Internet Archive, and they're also available on our YouTube channel. You can follow us on Facebook and X for more information about the activities that we sponsor. I am Don Wallachek. I'm a professor at this campus and also the moderator of this event. Today we will be discussing research publications done at the University of Puerto Rico. We will talk about this volume of Caribbean Studies, which was edited by Jessica Adams, and a second publication, Sargasso, Camps, Injustice, and Solidarity, which was edited also by Jessica Adams of this institution, as well as Nicole Herring and Roberta Meyerhofer of the University of Graz, and myself. This second volume, as you will hear, includes content that is the result of a conference that was held in Graz in 2022 of the same name, Camps, Injustice, and Solidarity. That conference was co-sponsored by the University of Graz and the University of Puerto Rico, Recinto de Rio Piedras. So we ask that you please turn off your cell phone and be conscious of the camera. We thank the Center for Educational Resources and Technology at Radio Universidad for collaborating with us today and taking care of much of the technology. And in the session of questions and answers, at the end of the event, we ask that you please use the hand mic, right? Wait for the hand mic, someone will bring it to you, and please speak into that. Okay, So we have two presenters today. Dr. Lidia Platon Lázaro of the University of Puerto Rico and Julia Roth of the University of Bielefeld. I will introduce them now. So Dr. Lidia Platon Lázaro will speak today about the Caribbean Studies volume, offer a review of it, and launch a discussion. She is an independent professor teaching in the English department of the College of General Studies. She is a curator, a writer, a performer, a cultural producer, and a translator. She's multi-talented. She is part of the work group called Taller Comunidad de Goico, which is a community collective that is developing cultural projects for peaceful cohabitation in the Manchucal neighborhood here in San Juan, Puerto Rico. She received an Andy Warhol Curatorial Research Fellowship in 2019 for her project Novenario, which was a reflection on the arts and mourning practices in contemporary art of Puerto Rico. Much of this engaged the experiences that arose in the context of Hurricane Maria. In addition, she has hosted a curatorial platform at Taller Comunidad de Goico called Nos Conocimos en los 90 with the Puerto Rican Arts Initiative. This is a project that was funded by the Mellon Foundation, the University of Texas at Austin, and Northwestern University. She is the author of two books. The first is Defiant Itineraries, Caribbean Paradigms in American Dance and Film, which was published by Palgrave Macmillan in 2015. Her second book is Ecos Huecos, which was published by La Impresora in 2021. She has written numerous articles and chapters. Most of these deal with topics around dance, theater, and performance. These appear in journals and anthologies. I will just mention a couple of them. One is called Screaming Soundscapes, the Sounds of Puerto Rican Contemporary Performance in the work of Teresa Hernandez and Yvette Roman. Another is titled The Possible from the Unknown, Transformations in the Present of Improvisation. Her translations have been published by Brookline Books, Politics for the People, and several journals. Our second speaker today is Julia Roth. She will discuss this volume of Sargasso, which, as you heard already, is titled Camps, Injustice, and Solidarity. Dr. Julia Roth is Professor of American Studies with a focus on gender studies at the University of Bielefeld in Germany. She is currently a visiting professor in Vienna, Austria. She holds a PhD in American Studies from Humboldt University of Berlin and has written on decolonial practices and gender. In addition, she has trained in the areas of American Studies, Hispanic Studies, and political science in a variety of places, including Casale, London, and Madrid. Her research interests include feminist and gender studies, post-colonial theory, decolonial approaches to culture, intersectionalities, and global inequalities, among others. She has held research and teaching positions in the Center for Inter-American Studies at the University of Bielefeld, the Humboldt University of Berlin, Free University of Berlin, and the University of Guadalajara. Alongside her academic work, she organizes cultural political events. She has numerous publications, including the co-edited volume, Feminisms in Movement, which was published in 2023. So we thank Dr. Lydia Platon and Dr. Julia Roth for being with us here today. Given that each of them will discuss one of these volumes, what I'd like to do right now is to present fairly briefly the contents of each one. And so Jessica Adams will come up and review the contents of the Caribbean Studies volume, and we will show that to you visually, and then I will review the table of contents for the Sargasso volume. And after that, we will turn it over to Lydia Platon, and she will present her remarks.
Okay, is this an appropriate placement for me? Can everybody hear me? It's good? All right, cool. Thank you, Don, for organizing this event. It's really special to be able to present this issue that we worked so hard on. I came in as interim editor of the journal in August 2023, so I kind of jumped in the deep end. And thanks to the support of the Institute personnel, including Jorge Giovanetti, Emmanuel Candelario, and Vivian Iglesias, I was able to hit the ground running. And we published groundbreaking and innovative work by both established and emerging scholars that I'm really excited about. I had done a lot of editing before I came into this position, but I had never edited a journal per se, and so I have to admit that it was a little bit stressful, and I stayed up nights a little bit, kind of wondering how we were going to pull this together, but I had so much support, and it was a really fantastic experience. I'd like to just briefly review the bios of these authors, and it's a little bit small, but I'll just give their name and the title of their work. Joniel Pacheco Munoz wrote an essay titled Tipas Raras Cargando un Movimiento, Reggaeton, Decoloniality, and Knowledge Through Subversion. Joniel is a doctoral student in Women and Gender Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Luis Rivera Figueroa, Yo no me quito, mensajes de terapia para la crisis económica en Puerto Rico. Luis is a doctoral student in radio, television, and film at UT Austin. Jeroen de Wolf, okay, and I'm so sorry, he told me that he had a class right now and he wasn't going to be able to attend. I am sure that I am not pronouncing his name correctly because me and German are like not close. So I apologize to German speakers. Jeroen wrote an essay called The Afro-Surinamese Do Dance and the Song Theater, a Historical Analysis in Caribbean Context. He is the Queen Beatrix Professor of Dutch Studies at the University of California, Berkeley, and teaches in Cal's folklore program, as well as being affiliated with African Studies and the Center for Latin American Studies. And Webster McDonald, his essay is titled Scripts of Sexual Ethics, Tensions and Violence within the in the Performance of Jamaican Citizenship. He's a postdoc currently at Northwestern in their Department of Performance Studies. The luminaries that we have featured in the In Memoriam section, it was just amazing to me to have their talents to draw on. And Paul Estrade, Humberto Garcia Muñiz, Ronald Salvon, and Kenneth Ramchand. I did my graduate work in Anglophone Caribbean literature in part, and the fact that I had Kenneth Ramchand's email address was like, I just couldn't believe it. I was like, oh my God. And he asked me to call him Ken. I was like, this is an apex of my professional career. And then the reseña del libro, my book review editor for this issue and ongoing is Jorge Lefebvre Tavares. He jumped in the deep end with me. We both started at the same time and pulled the issue together. Just another person that was wonderful to work with. So I wanted to just take a moment to highlight these contributors because you will want to check out their work. They're not just the essays in this volume, but all of their work. And to stay tuned for what they'll be doing next, because I know it's going to be really exciting. I would just like to take a moment to thank this extremely talented group of scholars for their contributions. It was just a pleasure and a privilege to work with them. And I will turn this over to Professor Platon. Yeah, to Dawn. Okay, I mean, some professor. I'm just going to step back now and turn it over.
So before we turn things over to Professor Platon, I will briefly tell you what is in the Sargasso volume. Okay, Sargasso is published in the Department of English in the College of Humanities. This year, it is very quietly turning 40, and it's a Caribbean Studies journal that focuses on language, literature, and culture. This particular volume deals with camps, injustice, and solidarity. And at its core, it has a focus on an important Caribbean site, and that site is Guantanamo Bay. And it deals with the history of that space and similar spaces in other parts of the Caribbean, and to some extent in other parts of the world. In particular, it deals with the usage of different sites of incarceration in the camps at the US military base at Guantanamo. And among the contributors, as you will hear in just a moment, are 5 former Guantanamo prisoners, right? Entonces, esta revista se publica en el Departamento de Inglés, en la Facultad de Humanidades, y el Departamento de Inglés co-auspició una conferencia en el año 2022 con la Universidad de Graz, y 3 exprisioneros de Guantánamo participaron presencialmente en la conferencia y 2 participaron virtualmente por Zoom. Y fue la primera vez que la mayoría de ellos participaron en una actividad académica. Y pues el volumen presenta algunos de los ensayos que fueron parte de la conferencia como presentaciones y también testimonios de los exprisioneros. Y Sargasso está celebrando 40 años de existencia este año. So, you know, in brief, the volume includes a poem by a man who is still imprisoned in Guantanamo, and I thank Mansour Adafi for securing the necessary permissions to include it here. The poet's name is Tawfiq al-Bihani, and he has been in prison for about 20 years, a bit more than 20 years, never charged with a crime or anything like that, like most of the prisoners that have been held there. The Caribbean becomes quite important to these men, and many of them have written about the Caribbean from Guantanamo. For example, the experience of animals that have visited them when they're outside, the sea, ideas about Cuba, interactions with different guards, including Puerto Ricans and Cuban Americans, this sort of thing. Poetry is also very important in this context. Quite a few prisoners in Guantanamo and in other sites of incarceration find writing poetry and reading poetry to be something that sustains them and gives them a lot of insight as well as strength. The conference in 2022 also featured quite a bit of poetry. So we found it quite fitting for the volume to do the same. So you can see that we have a local Puerto Rican poet as well, Gabriel Francisco Ruiz Rivera, and then Roque Raquel Salas Rivera translated that poem into English. We also have poetry by Mariana McDonald and Jose Ramon Sanchez Leyva from Guantanamo City, Cuba. There's a section called Juxtapositions right here. This is the section of testimonies by former prisoners, Mansour Adafi, Moussam Beg, Ahmed Irachidi, Lakhdar Boumediene, and Mohamedou Ould Slahi Hobeni. This section consists of a list of questions that were sent to them, and they responded to the questions. There's maybe 8 questions. And then we juxtapose all of their answers, right? So the first time that these come together, their answers is in this volume. The volume also includes academic essays by Naomi Pike, Marco Cabrera Geseric, Christian Schwick, Alexandra S. Moore, and Diana Murtal Coleman. All of these scholars were participants in the 22 conference. And then there's another section in which we have shorter essays and some creative contributions. Leah Pisek has a photo essay called Faces of Resilience, a photographic reflection on strength and perseverance that includes photos and commentary from the conference. Cecile Asilen has an essay, a personal essay about the history of Haitian incarceration at Guantanamo Bay, which happened mainly in the 1990s. Bernard Dock is a German legal scholar who writes about his experiences of representing a German prisoner and working towards his release. And then we have Jose Ramon Sanchez Leyva. We have an essay by him in which he discusses his obsession with the base and how he has reconstructed the base, built a new base using poems. And that essay has been translated into English by a student at this university who is completing her master's degree in translation, Sophia Oppenheimer. Then we have a second section of poetry called Postlude. And that includes poetry by Pamela Calero, Tallulah Stone, Amanda McIntyre, Maritza Stankic, professor of English in the College of Humanities, and Daisel R. Samad. The issue is wrapped up with a selection of book reviews. We have reviews by Elsa Luciana Feal, retired professor from the University of Puerto Rico in Arecibo, Elidio Latorre Lagares, professor of comp literature at this institution. He reviews Floaters, poems by Martin Espada, a very important collection of poetry that won the National Book Award recently. We also have Marian Christian's review and Daniel Nevares Arujo's book review, as well as a review by Yanire Diaz Rodriguez. So we merely wanted to go over the contents in this brief way so that when you hear the reviews of each volume, you won't be hearing the names and all of the details, for the first time. So now we will turn the microphone over to Lydia Platon.
Thank you, Don. Share. En lo que Emanuel nos ayuda aquí a cambiar de presentación, voy a decirlo formalmente, pero solo una pequeña corrección a todas esas credenciales que a veces uno vive la vida y pues uno va creando proyectos. Ecos Huecos fue una colaboración con mi compañero Juan Otero Garaviz, también profesor aquí, nuestro proyecto pandémico que como hoy estamos celebrando colaboraciones, me parece importante decir, ¿verdad? Sin la colaboración, estos volúmenes, estos testimonios de tanto trabajo no estarían aquí hoy para ser presentados. Así que gracias Don and Jessica. So, yo voy a hacer un poquito de code switching. I hope todo el mundo me oye, me ven. Allá en el otro mundo de allá, no sé, pero creo que sí. Thank you again, Jessica Adams and Don Wallachek, for inviting me to joyously celebrate this edition of Caribbean Studies, Volume 51, No. 2. Voy a entretejer mis palabras con mis dos idiomas, el español y el inglés, muy en el espíritu de esta publicación que siempre es plurilingüe. Y como en esta edición particular nos anuncia esta gran portada con Villano Antillano, es una invitación a pensarnos además Caribe trans, a pensarnos Caribe desde sus luces y sombras del pasado colonial y de pensarnos en una potencialidad descolonizadora. Las portadas del Caribbean Studies siempre son bien pensadas, cuidadas y una parte a la cual prestamos quizás menos atención. Pero yo pedí que Jessica me mandara copia, ¿verdad?, para mirar atrás. Y la verdad es que siempre es un trabajo que vale la pena ir porque la portada recoge visualmente lo que sus editoras y editores nos han querido hilar como esa historia que es una edición, que es la revista, ¿verdad?, completa. Y también para mí la suerte de haber mirado la portada con detenimiento es que, y no sé si a ustedes también les pasa, that when we are doing research and we go on the internet, we usually just hit the article directly and we're not really aware of what that whole volume really means. So I am especially happy that I got the opportunity through this invitation to read the issue from the perspective of its editorial narrative, the curatorship of the corpus, from the articles to the in memoriams to the book reviews. Ojo, I did not ask the editor, Jessica Adams, to corroborate that she approached the issue in this way. But once the issue is its own body, it becomes transformed. So, as does, ¿verdad?, Villano Antillano, with her music, her body, and her discourse as the icon of the cover in this case. Es la ícona de la portada. Así que voy a empezar por ese ensayo, que es el primero que aparece en el volumen, que fue escrito por Joniel Pacheco Muñiz, con el título que ya Jessica nos leyó, que es Tipas Raras Cargando un Movimiento, Reggaetón, Decoloniality and Knowledge Through Subversion, que nos invita a mirar a Villana y a otra rapera puertorriqueña que se llama Cita, desde una perspectiva de feminismo decolonial. While reviewing a brief history of reggaeton as a misogynistic genre, but also as a genre of resistance, the author brings up important themes of racial and gendered oppression while covering an ambitious list of rarezas, from sex work, violence, self-representation, and erasures. So I thought it was fun to very quickly look at a fragment of video clips from the two artists, because I think it embodies the article better than my words ever will. So, Emanuel, F5, share, ¿no? Solo, ¿a qué le doy? Aquí. Y a play. Bien cortito, all right?
Y échate pa' acá, papá, que te veo, mira que te miro y no te atreves a acercarte, ni agarrarme, ni besarme, porque sabes que por dentro tengo 7 mares, que te puedo ahogar, que te puedo refrescar, que te puedo revolcar, que te puedo calmar. Yo no sé, no me importa, pero échate pa' acá, que la música está buena y estoy loca por rozar. Qué tipa más rara, se encripa como el pelo, qué tipa más rara, te asusta con su vuelo, qué tipa más rara, tan fuera de criterio, lo llevo pa' mi pos y se me llenan de misterio. Qué tipa más rara, qué tipa más rara, qué tipa más rara, lo llevo pa' mi pos y se me llenan de misterio. Me estoy soltando, les tengo vacilando y eso que estoy empezando, como tupo en un gajo electrocutando. ¿Dónde está la...
Our following artist, we may know a little better, Villano Antillano. ¿Cómo voy al próximo slide? Aquí. So I'm going to play you a very short clip there as well. this coincidentally is also session 51. So
La villana. Yeah. Que si tengo flow cabrón, que si meto la presión, si tú no puedes conmigo, mala mía. Que si vengo pesadita, que si ya tengo tetita, si me tires con tu gato, mala mía. Que si vengo a tu motor, vengo desde el malecón, si no entiendes lo que digo, mala mía. Santa Rosa, Bayamón, mi niña de corazón, si no aguanta calentón, mala mía. La malabarista, soy una tenista, estoy cachando puntos con su bola por el Insta. Alma de poeta, la nueva Gabriela Mistral. Una puta atómica, soy una terrorista. Cuando cierro un beso, lo dejo de terapista. Te dije que no, cabrón, no me incita. Están en la fila, pero no están en la lista. Dale visa, explótame la pista. I'm on the top shelf, I'm such a bombshell. Todo el mundo ve que del dorado soy la shell. Todo el mundo quiere un pedazo de mi pastel. Perdí en el mar, soy yo, pa' y pastel. La muñeca, la brasa, los model de Mattel. Si no quiero contigo, no me tires a mi cel. A lo yo soy villana, mucho gusto, yo me apel. La Jennifer, la Aniston, aquella, la Rachel. Una vampiresa, soy una sanguinaria. Carmila, la de Tiria, soy inmune a tus plegarias. Yo soy la principal y tú la secundaria. Yo soy la principal de esta secundaria. Yo soy la jefa y tú eres la secretaria. No estás a nivel pa' ser mi adversaria. Mira cómo visto, cachame la indumentaria. Pa' mí no hay vacuna, soy como la malaria. A punto de entrar en un estado de psicosis. Wow, 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 no soy parte de tu posi. No corro contigo negativo, estoy posi. Yo solo te busco cuando quiero mi dosis.
So I think we get an idea there about, and I'm sorry for the language, I excuse my, well, that's in the material, right? So no podía editar yo a Villano especialmente para hablar de lo que este autor está haciendo, ¿verdad? We could see the qualities where Villana and Sita, as different as they are as artists and obviously in their gender identifications, serve as a particular way of looking at where we are placing in our scholarship the call to resistance, especially in Caribbean resistance modes that we have been studying for so long, and yet the more time passes, because I don't think I think it still passes like a spiral, we still find new ways to be able to talk about the oppression that these rarezas represent and the power of their music and their proposals. The following, really interestingly enough, so we go from Sita and Villana to Yo no me quito, right? Because we feel compelled to stay, to protest, to make our mark. However, Luis Rivera Figueroa is talking about Yo no me quito to talk about the irony of neoliberal discourse, because this was a campaign, I don't know if you remember, that was promoted by a corporate group called Bella Group. And the full article's name is Mensajes de Terapia para la Crisis. It is an analysis of the campaign ensuing from the 2015 economic crisis, when Puerto Rico was submerged in the nightmare of an unpayable debt. That, of course, has not ended, but through the analysis of the history of these kinds of campaigns to uphold national pride, among other things, we could see that the irony has just continued to play itself out, as we are now in all the political campaigns. And don't get me started, it's not part of this issue. It will be probably in the future. So he's using the campaign to foreground his analysis of Puerto Rico's history, nationalism, and economy, while proposing the duality of campaigns as logos for neoliberalism, like in a just do it Nike mentality of valuing individual success over the collective. However, this campaign took another turn, otro giro, like the rareza de las tipas raras of the prior article, un giro de colonial, a campaign as therapy, from bregar to rescate to pulling up by our bootstraps. The article poignantly makes the point that and this is quoting the article, la puertorriqueñidad como vehículo ideológico para el cambio social pierde su fuerza ante los esquemas de corrupción, la legitimación gubernamental de contratos desfavorables para las puertorriqueñas, el desplazamiento de la comunidad mediante la gentrificación, la privatización de los recursos naturales, en fin, hace la lista larga de las cosas que nos mantienen en el status quo a pesar de esta voluntad casi fatídica, ¿verdad?, del yo no me quito. So what the writer is inviting us to do is to see in what way we can really make it count. What does staying really mean in terms of facing what we're going through. And the performativities continue to drive this issue. Now we turn to Suriname with, I'm going to say it like this, Jeroen de Wolf's article that is titled The Afro-Surinamese Do Dance and Song Theater, a Historical Analysis in the Caribbean Context. This essay about satirical song and dance performance of the 19th century Suriname displays the duality of certain practices, as did the first essay about Villano and Sita and the analysis of Jono Mequito. It's really fascinating. These dances were led by the Sisi or the Misi, and I quote, a generally manumitted black female with whom a wealthy slaveholder lived in concubinage and organized by an association that was composed of enslaved and free Afro-Surinamese. Learning about the freedom within the satire that is allowed in the do, where abuses could be criticized and men made fun of publicly, the linguistic properties of Sranang, as also the Creole language that represents Afro-Surinamese populations. All this leads to the fact also that at the time, elite black females could aspire to autonomy and wealth, adds to these stories of Afro-Caribbean rituals as resistance. And they connect in a very special way to trans performances of Villano and resistance performance by Sita. However, here there's also an added level of perceived transgression that was described in the article. He's quoting a Dutchman who's observing these dances from a visit in the 1830s. And this Dutchman says, on New Year's Day, the spade and the whip are forgotten, and the dancers have become unrecognizable in their exotic clothing. He goes on to say, when seeing the nice clothing and loud joy, the Belgian found it hard to imagine that these dancers are the same slaves who are treated like beasts the rest of the week. There's a wonderful description of the do itself and the connection to other Caribbean performance practices of the time, the Jamaican set, and there are other examples that we may also consider in Puerto Rico as parallels with the African-derived dance practices that are exist throughout the Caribbean. Así que aquí veo el lujo como un punto de fuga, la danza y el movimiento como espacios de libertad y asociaciones nuevas para el desarrollo posterior de tradiciones cantadas y bailadas that are never going to forget this dual existence of being free only for the performance and then going back to bondage. The last article of this section is a circular closing to what began as the courage and the power of the tipas raras. Now we have an article about homophobia in Webster McDonald's Scripts of Sexual Ethics, Tensions and Violence with/in the Performance of Jamaican Citizenship. This article rounds out the prior three as I am reading the issue as a curated manuscript by exposing the genealogy of the way hate is built into a national discourse that transcends independence movements and modernity, stemming from the Jamaican Buggery Act of 1553. The author, using a dancer's leap as a metaphor, poetically announces that the leap embodied by this issue, Caribbean Studies number 51, allows for an evaluation of the tragic intersections of colonial practices and homosexual desire in Jamaica in both creative and critical ways. He continues to explain that beyond being a queer-identified critique, he is proposing a trans-effect, kinesthetic empathy, son palabras difíciles de pronunciar, me excuso, and trans-temporal affectivity as a gesture towards a decolonial world where the problem of countering neocolonialism is not a once colonized problem, but an everybody problem. The author uses his own performance pieces and practices to illustrate his topics, which allows us an imaginative space to connect to the theories of embodiment, of their autoethnography y la denuncia que quieren presentar mediante la creación, y esto desde el primer ensayo, la creación de peso del archivo, archival weight. This comes from the article, he calls it like a weighty archive. El archivo pesa, tiene peso, ¿verdad? Y es el cuerpo que estos ensayos cargan. Y así lo rinde este ensayo en particular, es un ensayo sumamente conmovedor, y cito del ensayo: "Perhaps another Jamaica is coming, where queer avowal/disavowal, embedded here, can be read by someone under more favorable conditions. Until then, what the queer Jamaican has is an alternative participation in citizenship through the performance of queerness outside of Jamaica," que es donde está localizado su autor. "An important reminder about where we are authorized to read ourselves, to be ourselves." Then, cryptically somehow, in memoriam follows these statements, these very moving articles. And these are testimonies of fellow Caribbeanists saying goodbye to dear friends who are colleagues. As a coda of the search for more liberating ways to see ourselves, in these articles, the in memoriams are a space of unaltered humanity in our Caribbean affection space, nuestro paisaje cultural afectivo. The public performances of dying include these discourses that somehow alleviate grief. They allow a trace, a summary of one part of a person's life. In this case, and dear to this university, the memorial passages begin with the Paul Estrade's goodbye to one of the Institute's researchers, historian Félix Ojeda Reyes, with the title "Betancino hasta los tuétanos," an homage, but also a chronicle that elicits a smile, told with humor and true affection for a man who had many friends and convictions. Then Humberto García Muñiz, who I think also directed the Institute, celebrates Ojeda's life with a traditional in memoriam, a review of his works, and gratitude for his generosity. Y le sigue otro patriota, Jean-Pierre Santon de Guadeloupe, a quien Ronald Selbon le reconoce la virtud de ser un historiador a quien lo define un equilibrio valiente entre el rigor científico y el deseo de la emancipación. Es un hermoso cumplido, y el In Memoriam incluye referencias a sus obras que nos pueden servir en nuestras futuras búsquedas en estas profundidades oceánicas del archipiélago. Luego, Kenneth Ramchand, I was also very impressed to read him writing from that personal voice, le rinde tributo a Brinsley Samaru en un texto donde la historia y la memoria plasman la vida de un ser apasionado, un defensor de instituciones culturales trinitenses que no pudieron ver la luz por la burocracia harta conocida en nuestro Caribe tropical. Ramchand also pens a farewell note to Michael Anthony, a historian, educator, and friend, as he says. Ramchand, like Estrade, when talking about Felix, uses the anecdotal memories to evoke the life of the dead. And in a phrase I marked when reading, which also connected me to the articles that I had read before, says the following about Anthony: "He was never distracted from being native and authentic, and he never attempted to echo foreign ideologies or theories of our society. That's being indigenous and revolutionary without polemic." It is also a great way to describe the liberating practices that have been described to us in the articles that referenced performative practices. Even though written due to the inevitability of death, it is the afterlives that resonate and allow this continuum to come alive as scholars, artists, and believers of a dedicated journal to Caribbean studies such as this one. Finally, we reach the book review section, edited by Jorge Lefebvre Tavares. Here, the selection, curiously in tune with the performance topics of the articles, begins with a performer's book. Ana Min Santiago, actress, writer, and she writes about Eugenio María de Hostos, Praxis Teatral. It was published by La Casa Editora de Puerto Rico in 2022. Looking at Hostos feasibly, she says, for the first time from that theatrical perspective. And then we have another kind of performance, José Luis Colón González's Alianzas dentro del poder, el Partido Obrero Insular y los partidos municipales en Arecibo, de 1910 a 1915, also published in 2022 and reviewed by Edgardo Ramírez Rivera. It is a performance in itself of the struggles of workers' rights. Hopefully, I did not give too many spoilers, but rather piqued your interest on this well-compiled selection of new intellectual production that weaves a tapestry of performance outlooks on very contemporary, even though they're from the 19th century, some of them, or even from 1553, laws that certainly still mark us, Caribbean realities, looking back on historical foundations for certain practices, and a necessary look into the past, like Cita's huge mirror as a sea womb, ¿verdad? Un útero de mar. El mar como este recipiente útero de un Caribe que acuosa y saladamente está descolonizándose, ojalá. And before I finish, curiously, I also thank the queer identifications of the beginning, because all the authors in this volume are visibly, I don't know, maybe biologically gendered as men, which is also, it's interesting, even though there's one woman's piece. But because of the different intersections of, especially the first and the last essay, we do believe that it is for an everybody problem, as the Caribbean, the Jamaican article points to. I think for now, that's all I have. So I have to go. F5, ahora sí. Tú lo haces. Ay, gracias.
Thank you, Julia. We'll turn it over to you now. All right? Yes, we can hear you fine.
Which is based on this conference, brilliantly captures the urgent and timely spirit and the fantastic interdisciplinary and solidarity-oriented character of the event, as the title already indicates, right? So I guess that just like me, everyone who joined was immediately aware of how important the intervention this conference represented and made was. And as Donna illustratively recalls in its introduction, the conference addressed one of the pressing phenomena of our current and complex time, which at the same time has a very long colonial and violent history, since it elaborated on the practice of creating extra-legal spaces. Don mentioned the importance of space when we talk about Guantanamo, but also about spaces in the Caribbean and worldwide. And these extra-legal spaces, which with Agamben one could call that follow the logic of camps. So there's this sort of logic already related to such spaces, since these spaces serve to measure those in the camp by very different criteria than those criteria that are valid for the rest of society, or to exclude them from the access to rights and humanity altogether. So the anniversary of the US military detention camp in Guantanamo, Cuba, which was also the occasion on which the conference was organized, provides probably the most insightful and symbolic examples of such a space, and the long legacy that is being sort of recalled in many of the reflections include forms of organization of plantations under slavery, of reservations and restricted lands, of indigenous communities, or the exclusion and extermination of dehumanized people in concentration camps in the colonies in Africa and other places, and later in Europe, who point to this bloody history of encampment, if you want to call it that. And since Dawn already elaborated on the overall structure of the volume, I will improvise a little and focus particularly also on the artful, I want to call it curation of the volume. Since I think beyond the wonderful contents that I will briefly mention but not sum up all of the rich different genres and forms, provide an exemplary, if not model way of not only naming, addressing, analyzing, and rendering problematic structures of violence as represented in camp spaces, but also to actually offer ways how to do things differently. But to begin with, the urgency and relevance of the content and the phenomenon of Guantanamo and camps is clearly reflected in the was on the one hand also clearly reflected in the fact that there was already a follow-up conference this year that I also had the luck to attend. But it's also addressed in Naomi Park's essay that's based on her wonderful keynote, I suppose, where she in line with many of the practices that were also addressed at the second conference, where more recent practices that also follow camp-like logics, like refugee camps that Ruth Bouchani also elaborated on and also fights against in his insightful life writing texts, is a message that Naomi Pike already expresses in her fabulous essay that she calls Guantanamo Travels, which is a telling title since she traces what she terms the label, how the label of Guantanamo is being used to describe other sites of detention and to address the injustices related to them and the rights violations that happen in those spaces, from torture to the denial of citizenship rights and many more. Her mapping, that's an interesting practice that I think we can discuss also as one way of resisting counter mappings of hegemonic maps, of how such travels of the label or Guantanamo demonstrates how different liberal democratic empires learn from one another, and also how the experiences of people that are detained in the name of the war on terror resonate with those by victims of criminal legal systems and border regimes and other side of encampment worldwide, and she gives insightful examples for that. She finally argues for the abolition of the carceral border, as she called it, and of imperial regimes on which institutions such as Guantanamo stand. So a very radical stand. She reminds us that what is at stake is more than just criticizing individual cases and stories, which of course is an important tool and means of criticizing the structures and the human rights violations and so on. But that to actually alter these injustices, we need to be more radical and fight for their abolition. So in the same line, in his fine introduction, Don Molicek quotes Amy Capon to remind us that we do not resist, if we do not resist and shift or contradict the hegemonic or dominant narrative, which in the case of Guantanamo is the US version, places like the US naval base in Guantanamo run the risk of becoming the norm rather than an exception or an anomaly, as some have it, but rather sort of, and I think this trend is sort of normalized already in many places if we look at current armed conflict and so on, and border regimes and camp-like structures and the denial of human rights. So Dawn, in line with Kaplan, also encourages us to interrupt the stories that the US empire and other powerful players tell about themselves. Since, as Mohamed Ould-Slahi puts it in this juxtaposition section of the book that I appreciate a lot, I enjoyed reading, quotes from a Muslim proverb, I think, until the lion learns how to write, every story will glorify the hunter. And that's something maybe also of a motto of the volume, and this discourse and debate and intervention that it sort of stands for and incorporates and symbolizes. And all the contributions to the volume are also testimony of such interruptions and of forms of resistance to attempts of normalization or invisibilization of the injustices related to the structures and their normalization. And this reminded me personally of a comment by a human rights lawyer, Wolfgang, who's director of the European Center for Constitutional and Human Rights. This organization also, I think, defends some of the former and still detainees of Guantanamo. And they also interestingly published a volume for the anniversary of the Guantanamo camp, in which they included lots of artworks and drawings and so on. But he says, from a human rights perspective, the U.S. really, with Guantanamo, lost credibility, and that this is sort of what we see now also, that this empire is no longer accepted by other forces around the globe, and Guantanamo probably, also Abu Ghraib and other human rights violations, but related to the war on terror, are key here. And I think what this points to also is the necessity to share experiences, testimonies, and narratives of oppression and injustice in different forms and ways. So the volume is curated in an interesting way. Don mentioned it. It starts with poems. So poems are central, are key. That's the door, the entrance to the topic, to the volume, and the more abstract and extensive reflections and academic essays come rather late. So I think that's also interesting. And the juxtaposition section is also forms a central part of the volume. So it includes essays on historical forms of camps and injustices in the Caribbean and Europe, and also the arbitrariness of such institutions and the global entanglements they have already embodied 100 years ago, as Christian Zwick's contribution on a Jewish Austrian detainee in Trinidad under the Nazi regime exemplifies. So the conference also included tours to former concentration camps around Graz, so to draw these connections, to not limit the logic of such human rights violations to a particular geographic or national context, but rather say that this logic has happened and can potentially happen almost everywhere. So as mentioned, the volume unites poems, drawings, and reflections on the tools from the arts and the humanities. For example, on theater, in the reflection of Mohammed Oud-Slahi's theater piece, Freedom, and all of these forms make injustices effectively and aesthetically accessible. And that's an important dimension, I think, in order to really grasp and relate to what these violations mean. We do need the voices of those who experience them, but also other means of connecting to all of these dimensions, and also the unsayable dimensions of such horrible experiences. As Don also mentioned, the volume includes modes of scientific and on-site theory making, like Lea Pashta's photo essay on the conference, which I enjoyed very much revisiting also, since it's sort of recalling all of these encounters and memories that the conference space also offered. And I think the former detainees in the juxtaposition section also reflect on how special it was for them to be the stars also, if I may put it that way, in this encounter and dialogue, and to, as one of them mentioned, for the first time joined an international encounter again after being in the camp for years, if not decades. So, as mentioned, through this particular curation, resistance to norms and hegemonies is expressed also already in the volume's order and form. So it seems just logical that it starts with a section of these impressive and moving poems that delineate what it means to be detained without a charge, and also point to the practice of poetry, which Dawn also already mentioned, that because many of the detainees wrote poems, and this, as literary and cultural studies scholars, is interesting for us that there's this function also of survival, of coping through poetry also. And I remember one of the most impressive moments of the conference was also when Jose Ramon Sanchez Leya, the poet from the city of Guantanamo in Cuba, which is at 15 kilometers distant to the camp, expressed his sort of reflections on the detainees and how touched one of them was when knowing that someone very close was actually thinking about him, and he wasn't aware of that since you are totally isolated in such camp-like spaces usually, where there's hardly in a connection to the outside world. This was a starkly touching moment, I guess, but it points also to the essence of our common humanity and what is at stake when we give up the notion of sameness, justice, and equal rights. And most importantly, when we start considering that the lives, rights, and pain of some are more important, valid, and valuable than that of others. I also very much appreciate this translation work that the volume offers, especially concerning the poems. So I think this is very important if we want to continue this dialogue. But the resistant aesthetic value is also further underlined by the materiality of a number of the works included, such as the drawings, but also the reproduction of the sketchbook. There's one poem is written on one or printed, reproducing the paper sheet with lines on it, stamped as unclassified in the case of Tawfiq al-Biarani's poem, who is still in the camp, as we just heard, and where we really see what these texts look like, and that's how Mohammed Ould Slahi also published the first uncensored version of his diary, where large parts are blackened, right? So this constant practice of censorship, and their writing, expressing oneself, poetry, become key also with regards to agency, I think, and it's very telling that most of those regimes and camps try to keep the detainees from writing by not giving them access to pen and paper, let alone computers, by censoring or destroying texts and so on, and making it hard or impossible to smuggle them out of the institutions. Judith Butler has elaborated on the first poems that were smuggled out of Guantanamo, I think on styrofoam cups, since there was no paper available. So this materiality also, I think, is interesting to think about as a resistance strategy. And some of the former detainees themselves mention how important writing was for them, like Mansour al-Dayafi and others even speak of a coping mechanism and a catharsis, a means of survival, if one will. But at the same time, mention that this can be traumatic and also painful, remembering trauma and torture. And Mansour al-Dayafi speaks of the, and I quote, emotional labor related to his particular writing process also. And this is made very visible, and that's also one form of materiality and reflection, I think, that is constantly present in the volume. So for all of them, the importance of telling one's individual story to point to broader structures and systems of injustice is crucial. So the individual and the collective, right? So I write also to point to the situation of those who are still not free. And that's also something that has a long tradition. So, for instance, in so-called slave narratives, where also the power of writing becomes obvious in subtitles like written by herself or himself in particular US context, and point also to the exclusion from literacy and means of publication and so on. And how important the act of writing is, and how those in power often consider it as dangerous, endangering their power usually, because people can organize and can express themselves, and also maybe are less open to being broken through torture or so. So the volume and the conference it is based on furthermore points to the important link between legal imaginaries and discourses with personal narratives, testimonies, and works of art, and also our work as literary and cultural studies scholars or linguists, media scholars, and so on, scholars from the humanities. More importantly still, it points to the power of compassion and insistence on relationality, and also on alternative notions of conviviality and the social. And this is, I think, beautifully represented in the little drawing on the cover, where we see the bunch of flowers sort of looking out of the cell of the. Here. So if we continue to join forces, as this volume does, the hope that is expressed in this drawing on the cover moves into closer reach. So I'd like to end with the words by Mansour al-Dafi in the interview, or the juxtaposition section included in the volume. So if the conference, and I will add the volume, symbolize the broader message of solidarity with all who endure oppression and marginalization, it served as a potent reminder that our commitment to justice knows no bounds. It extends beyond geographical borders and transcends cultural diversities. And as is true for the conference, as it is for the volume, and I quote Mansour again, we are collectively reminded of our shared responsibility to stand in solidarity with the marginalized and oppressed. The Sargasso double volume on Camps and Justice and Solidarity offers not only the content and stories, I would argue, for such an endeavor of solidarity and thinking things otherwise and doing them otherwise, but it provides and exemplifies also a respective methodology. So I think it is a must-read or a joy for those who had the luck to attend and participate in the encounter and the conference, but even more so for those who did not, to see and get an illustrative and inspiring example of how to start such a dialogue and in the end overcome the structures that are delineated but also criticized, and imaginatively overcome in the texts and contributions. Thank you.
Gracias, Lydia Platoni, y gracias, Julia Roth. We thank both of you for your comments. We have a few moments now, a few minutes for question and answer. Would anyone in the audience or online like to get this next segment started? Looks like these messages are old. There's a chat, but if anyone has a comment or question, we have the sound on, so you can write. We have one of the co-organizers of the conference with us, Professor Roberta Meyerhofer at the University of Graz. Roberta, I'm in the process of unmuting you. Let's see if I can do it now. There you are. Okay, thank you for being with us.
Yeah, thank you for the two presentations. Of course, you never find me time to read it yourself. And a number of my students here on the online platform. So the encouragement is, of course, to see this as a teaser, as a trailer, as sort of offering the possibility of reading the text themselves and also connecting to a community of scholars on different levels of their careers who want to think of an interdisciplinary approach, especially as we show in both text text the European American connections that are there, not just historically, but also in terms of redefining it and re-arguing these aspects. So thank you both for presenting this. Hybrid is always difficult because it does connect distance, but it sometimes, of course, reinforces in a not embodied state. But I think we managed to get a feel for both of the texts, and I hope sort of a number of us will go back to the written word again and revisit.
Thank you. And thank you for, of course, for once again, I've thanked you before, but thank you for making the conference possible. We had the conference in Graz for many reasons. One reason is that former prisoners of Guantanamo cannot enter Puerto Rico or the United States, but we were able to secure, their entry in Austria. ¿Alguien aquí tiene una pregunta sobre el volumen de Caribbean Studies o el volumen de Sargasso? Tenemos algunos de los autores aquí con nosotros, también los editores. Ambas revistas presentan oportunidades para estudiantes en el recinto. Muchos estudiantes que quieren escribir comienzan con reseñas, ¿no? Y en ambos volúmenes podemos ver la importancia de las reseñas, ¿no? Mi primera publicación fue en Sargasso, hace, no sé, como 20 años, más o menos, un poquito más, ¿no? So we're just talking about journals as an opportunity, a publication opportunity for students. We have student contributors here. And how among those opportunities is the opportunity to do a book review, which is sometimes more manageable than doing an article, but of course both are possible. We have Diana Coleman here, who is one of the authors, Eva Bauer, who has assisted with the organization of the conference, Sophia Oppenheimer, who translated for this volume. And of course we have Jessica Adams, who contributed to both and is connected, in multiple ways. And she and I worked on a Guantanamo project 7 or 8 years ago. Y ese proyecto nuestro sobre Guantánamo comenzó con una taza de café en la sala de mi apartamento. Y ella me preguntó, ¿qué quieres hacer? ¿No? Y luego me preguntó algo como, ¿qué harías si podrías hacer lo que sea? ¿No? Like, she asked me, what do you want to do? We were talking about working on a project together. But then she asked me a better question. She said, what would you do if you could do anything? And my response to that was, I would do something on Guantanamo. And then of course, what came right after that was, well, why aren't you doing it? Like, what's stopping you, right? Y así comenzamos. That's how we started this project that later developed into a joint project with the University of Graz. Any comments or questions from anyone online? Well, if,
just encourage everyone to submit their work to the
yeah.
journals.
Yes, Jessica is here, and Jessica Adams is here, the former editor of Caribbean Studies, and Leila Rodriguez is the current editor of that journal. She's an anthropologist, and we would like everyone here to remember that this publication opportunity is a standing one. Both journals, Caribbean Studies and Sargasso, are always accepting work, and they remind us of the importance of research by academics and by students, and how much you can learn, through that. This campus is a research institution. Lots of people have made sacrifices again and again over multiple generations to secure research as something that must be done here. Not every campus in the UPR system is like that. So, you know, we're glad that we are and that we've been able to maintain that despite numerous challenges, including massive $1 million budget cuts. And so these journals are an example of how that insistence has worked out on the page. Okay, well, it looks like we don't have any other comments or questions at this time. So in closing, I would just like to thank you for being here today and for participating. Muchas gracias por asistir en esta actividad. Si quieres comprar una copia en papel de estos dos volúmenes, están disponibles, $10 precio de descuento, right? Y están aquí en la mesa. Si prefieren recibir una copia electrónica, favor de dejarme saber y puedo facilitar ese proceso, ¿no? So the journals are both available electronically, and they can also be purchased today for a special price of $10, right? So thanks everyone for being here. We hope to see you at a future activity of the Institute of Caribbean Studies. All the best.
Thank you, everyone. Ciao.
Nada, yo creo que son las conexiones que Sagrado is like being so active.